Did Jesus use the Septuagint? That's the key question we're asking today, and there are two other related questions that this video seeks to address. Now, I've poured hours and hours into this video, and I'd hate for the YouTube algorithm to just crush this, but I'm going to run a risk, and I'm going to give you my conclusions right at the beginning for those of you who just came for the quick answer. But in return, would you please give this video a like if you at least appreciate me giving you the quick answer right up front. Did Jesus use the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament? My answer to that, my conclusion is yes, with some important qualifications, and we'll get into that. Number two, does this make a difference? My answer is absolutely. In fact, I'm going to run through a number of examples today, and I think you'll see in my second example that the point that Jesus makes, if he were quoting from the Hebrew Bible, at least as we have it today, would not even land with his audience. Number three, should we abandon the Masoretic text and use only the Septuagint? My answer to that is no, and I'll give a nuanced explanation for why we need both. Now, for those of you that are still here, the rest of this video is really for you. And for those of you that make it all the way to the end of the video, please let me know that you made it to the end by typing in the comments, digging deep. And as a reward for you sticking all the way to the end, I'm going to address head on one of the chief objections that people make against Jesus using the Septuagint. And that is, if Jesus predominantly spoke Aramaic, then why would it be that he would be quoting the Septuagint? And I'm going to address this not just with feelings or what I think. We're going to go into some surprising archaeological data, some that you probably never even heard of. In fact, we'll talk about a fascinating artifact called the Nazareth tablet. By the time we get to the end of that, I think we'll put one of the key objections to rest. Now, let's hasten right to our first example. There's a line that Jesus reads in the synagogue, and it's missing in the Hebrew Bible, not mistranslated, missing. Let's go right to that in Luke chapter 4. It says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind." I want you to zero in on that phrase. That line, recovery of sight to the blind, that is missing in the Hebrew text. If you go back to Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 through 2, I'll display that on the screen for you. You will search in vain for that line, recovery of sight to the blind. This suggests that Jesus was using a text that included the same line that's found in the Greek Septuagint. Now, one of the objections that people have about Jesus using the Septuagint is they think that maybe the gospel writers, let's say in this example, Jesus was actually reading a Hebrew scroll here, and Luke just found his Septuagint and just supplied the quote from his Septuagint and is not quoting Jesus verbatim. Now, I want to address that as we get further on into the video, but I think you'll see how it becomes even problematic in our second example, why that doesn't really work. So while this first example, you might try to wiggle out of it, I think the next one is impossible to explain. And let me show you why. In Matthew chapter 21 and verse 16, the children shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David" in the temple. The Pharisees were indignant and demanded that he silence them. But Jesus replied, "Yes, have you never read, out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants, you have perfected praise." Zero in on that line, perfected praise. That comes from Psalm 8. But let's see what it sounds like in a Jewish translation of the Hebrew Bible. "Out of the mouth of babes and sucklings hast thou founded strength." Well, founding strength or establishing strength is very different than perfecting praise. So why would Jesus quote something about founding strength when the children are there praising? In other words, the difficulty here is not just that they don't line up verbatim. I get that. I understand that. The issue here is that either Jesus cited Psalm 8 or he didn't. So you have to make a move to say, if you want to say that Jesus wasn't using the Septuagint, or wasn't using a text that more closely aligned with the Septuagint, then you'd have to say that Matthew put a verse on Jesus's lips that he didn't use. Because why would you quote this verse if he's not actually talking about praise, which is what these children were doing? You see the difficulty here. But the difficulty entirely vanishes away if you follow the Septuagint. The Septuagint version, and I'm going to quote Brenton's translation here, "Out of the mouth of babes and sucklings hast thou perfected praise." So here again, we have Jesus's quotation more closely aligning with the Greek Septuagint. And again, we're going to talk about the importance of the Masoretic text. I'm not trying to get you to throw away the Hebrew Bible or anything like that. We're going to get into some of these nuances, but stick with me as we go through some more of these examples. Here's one from Matthew chapter 19 and verse 5. And this goes right to the marriage covenant. And in fact, this verse is often quoted in weddings. And the question is, are we slightly misquoting it? Well, let's see what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 19, verse 5. He says, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." The two shall become one flesh. Now, the emphasis here is on the two. The Jewish Publication Society's translation of the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible goes like this: "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." No mention of the two. But the Greek Septuagint has the two. And what's interesting here is the Septuagint is not alone. The Syriac, a Targum manuscript, the Vulgate, and guess what? This is quoted multiple times in the New Testament by different authors. We find it in Matthew, we find it in Mark, and we find it in 1 Corinthians, and we find it by Ephesians. So we have a really good explanation for what happened here. And an independent scholar, Wayne Mitchell, has done some work on this. He sent me his work on this, and I'll display a full quotation on the screen, but I'll try to give you a summary of it. He gave me permission to share this with you from his book, Scribal Skips. But if you put this back into Paleo-Hebrew, it's very easy to see how a scribe's eye just skipped over the words, the two. And so I believe that Jesus wasn't just willy-nilly quoting anything. I think that he quoted the text as it was originally given, and we are given multiple witnesses to suggest that Jesus was quoting it accurately, and the Septuagint got it right. Now, let's hasten on to our next example. And this is found in Mark chapter 7 and verse 6, going on into verse 7. Let me read it to you. He said to the Pharisees, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." Now notice the difference here. When Jesus quotes this, he says, "In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." Notice the change that takes place as I read it from the Jewish Publication Society translation. And I'll just focus on these key lines here. "But have removed their heart far from me." Instead of "in vain they worship me," it has, "but have removed their heart far from me, and their fear of me is a commandment of men learned by rote." Now, this is a fairly significant difference, but Jesus's quotation more closely aligns with the Septuagint than what we have in the Hebrew Bible today. The Septuagint cuts just a little bit sharper. Now, let me give you one more example, and then we're going to go head on to one of the chief objections that people raise about the idea that Jesus could be using the Septuagint. And I would suggest that this example is more indicative of the kinds of examples that you get throughout the New Testament. They're usually very subtle. So in John 6, verse 45, it is written in the prophets, "And they shall all be taught by God. Therefore, everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me." Now, that's a quotation from Isaiah 54:13. But when you look at it in the Masoretic text, I'll read again from the Jewish translation, and all thy children shall be taught of the Lord. John has taught by God, and the Jewish translation has taught of the Lord. Now, that Lord is in capital letters, and that signifies the tetragrammaton, that is Yahweh. Now, what John has done is he's quoted the text as it more closely aligns with the Septuagint by using God. Usually, when the Septuagint encounters the divine name Yahweh, it translates it Kyrios. But if you look at the Septuagint, in Isaiah 54:13, it says, and all thy children shall be taught of God. So sometimes when you go through these citations, yes, it will be true that Jesus will more closely align with the Septuagint than the Masoretic text, but sometimes the difference is very subtle, like this one. Not whole lines missing or anything like that, but just little differences. Now let's move into the second phase of this whole video, and really this whole segment is dedicated to those who are digging deep. As a matter of fact, just for fun, let's change it up a little bit. You aren't just digging deep, you are digging deeper. Put in the comments if you've made it this far in the video, digging deeper, because really now we're going to get down into it, get down into the details. And as someone who's had the privilege of teaching Greek to other people, I can appreciate how important it is to get down into the details, because people will say things about the Septuagint and about the New Testament quotations which just are not true. And so it's really nice to be able to actually go to the Greek text, and this is what I did here. I went to the Greek New Testament. I also went to the Greek Septuagint, and some of the claims that were made about these things were not so. So one of the interesting things is a major Bible dictionary that was put out there claimed that all of Matthew's quotations aligned with the Septuagint. That is patently false. So for example, in Matthew chapter 2, Matthew quotes Hosea, and out of Egypt have I called my son, singular, but the Old Greek, the Septuagint, has children, or has it in the plural. And so the point that Matthew's making wouldn't work in the Septuagint. So here's the point. Matthew is quite capable of going back to the Septuagint, and he's quite capable of going back to the Hebrew text. He could do either one, and it's not as if he just had to find his Septuagint and try to find the reference and supply it on the lips of Jesus. Matthew knew what he was doing, and he shows that he has a deep grasp of the Bible. Another objection that people would make is to say, well, the gospel writers, the New Testament writers, really didn't care that much about what they were actually quoting. They didn't really mind that much if they quoted this or quoted that, and it didn't really matter to them. I think if we're not careful, we could undermine the role of God in all of this. We believe these books are inspired by God. In fact, my whole case today hangs on the idea that I believe that Scripture is breathed out by God. And so I think it's enormously important that we take these words very seriously. And when Jesus, like as in my second example, when Jesus is making a point that hangs on a couple words, we need to take it very seriously. Paul could make a point in the book of Galatians based on whether a word was singular or plural, whether it's seed or seeds. He believed in the inspiration of Scripture that thoroughly, that he could make a point just based on whether a word was singular or not. And so I think we need to give the gospel writers more credit, and really give God more credit for how he chose for some of these things to be quoted. Now let's address head on what I told you we would address, and that is, if Jesus predominantly spoke Aramaic, would it even be feasible that he would be quoting the Septuagint? Now here's where I want to put my important caveat. It is possible that in some of these examples, like the example of the two shall become one flesh, that Jesus was actually quoting maybe a Hebrew edition, and it just happened to more closely align with the Septuagint. But that doesn't undermine the case that I'm making. That strengthens it to show the value and importance of the Septuagint. Now, in saying all of that, I'm not undermining the importance of the Masoretic text, because I need to add this here, is that there are some quotations of Jesus that more closely align with the Masoretic text than it does the Septuagint. Now, in my study, I found that the more significant ones, the more important ones where you have like a whole line that is missing, those tend to follow the Septuagint. So the majority of the quotations that I looked at seem to me to more closely align with the Septuagint, but there are cases where some of the quotations of Jesus more closely align with the Masoretic text. We still need the Masoretic text. And I'm not saying that the Septuagint is superior. What I'm trying to do is raise people's awareness to get them interested in the Septuagint. But I've deviated now from my main point. And is it possible that Jesus was actually speaking Greek in many of these instances? And I think the answer is a resounding yes. And I'm going to bring you again some more receipts. We have an inscription. It's called the Theodotus inscription. It's the oldest inscription that we have from a synagogue. It dates to around the time of Jesus, before the fall of Jerusalem. And guess what? It's an inscription that's written not in Aramaic, not in Hebrew, but written in Greek. And this is highly significant because it's found in the vicinity of Jerusalem. So it's highly possible that the people in the synagogue there were speaking Greek to one another, not necessarily Aramaic every time. So it's hard to overstate the importance of this finding. So I will mention just briefly another artifact which is highly interesting that sometimes comes up in these discussions. It's called the Nazareth tablet, and it's interesting for a number of reasons. Number one, it was acquired in the city of Nazareth. Number two, it's dated between 50 BC and 50 AD, right around the time of Jesus. Number three, it's written entirely in Greek. And number four, it talks about giving a warning about robbing graves, which sounds an awful lot like what happened in Matthew when people were claiming that Jesus' disciples stole Jesus' body. Now, there's pushback that's been made on this about its location and things like that, but it does date to this time period. It was acquired in Nazareth, and the pushback is that the marble itself would have come from a different vicinity. But there's a great article on this, kind of weighing the pros and cons of this piece of evidence. But let me hasten to add here some more interesting archaeological data. In ancient Jerusalem, about 40% of the surviving first century Jewish funeral inscriptions are in Greek. What's also very fascinating is that when you begin to study some of Jesus' sermons, and Peter Williams, a Syriac scholar, has done some work on this. If you look at Matthew chapter 5, what Jesus says works really good in Greek because there's this beautiful wordplay and alliteration. It doesn't work in Aramaic. And so it really looks like this sermon would have been delivered in Greek because of all the telltale signs of the beauty that's there in this sermon. Now, you might say that Matthew is the literary genius, but I'm going to say that Jesus was indeed the literary genius, to echo some words from Peter Williams. We could go on and on with this, but just consider the conversation that Jesus had with Nicodemus. Nicodemus is a Greek name, by the way. He's a Jewish rabbi with a Greek name, and he has a conversation with Jesus about being born again or being born from above. And there's this Greek wordplay that goes on in this conversation that, again, works perfectly well if Jesus were speaking to Nicodemus in Koine Greek. So I think we have good reasons to think that Jesus was having conversations in Greek and probably was doing some of his preaching and teaching in Greek. If that's the case, I think at least in some parts of the Gospels, we may have the actual very words of Jesus precisely how he said them. And so I think that is incredibly fascinating. And I think it adds plausibility to the fact that Jesus may have indeed quoted the Septuagint. That's fascinating, and I think it's worth your attention and time. Thank you so much for watching. And if you want to see even more evidence that Jesus may have used the Septuagint, watch this video next.